Good morning, I'm WaywornWyrm, and welcome to my channel. And welcome to the first video in my series where I go through the D&D 5th edition monster manual. As I said in the intro to this, I'm starting in Appendix B, and we'll go through backward through the book. So today we're starting with the Acolyte and the Priest, two very similar stat blocks. As is true for almost every entry in Appendix B, Acolytes can be any race and any alignment. A good thing to do to quickly change the stats of this NPC is give it racial abilities, and if you're looking for some optimization, pick the Furblog, a playable race you can find in Volo's Guide to Monsters, as that is the only race that gives a +2 to Wisdom. There are several sub-races and a couple of races that give a +1 to Wisdom, but other than the Furblog, no one gets a +2. And the reason why we want a high Wisdom is that's the spellcasting ability for the clerics, which an Acolyte is a low-level cleric. It has an AC of 10 and a hit point range of 2 to 16, which is from 2d6, with the average of that being 9. So even a first level party should be hitting it about 3/4 of the time, and depending on what weapons they're using and how they roll, they can probably kill it in 1 to 3 hits. The only bonus to stat modifiers it has is a Wisdom of +2. It's trained in medicine and religion, a passive perception of 10, and can speak one language of your choice. Challenge rating 1/4. And it can cast 3 cantrips, and has 3 first level spots and 3 spells to go with those slots. There's a club attack that has +2 to hit, and does either 2 damage or 1d4, depending on if you roll for your NPCs or not. As you can tell from the stat block, it's a really basic low-level NPC. In fact, it's essentially a first-level cleric, which is where I would start when changing this NPC, but I'll get to that in a minute. Acolytes are junior members of the clergy, generally those who are in training to be priests or clerics or the like. They're also the ones who do menial tasks and probably do most of the magical healing for the temple they're in, with their first level slots being used for the spell Cure Wounds. I can see really just 3 different uses for this NPC that fundamentally change how you would play it. The first would be in an urban temple or other large temple. In that case, there should be dozens and dozens of acolytes that do all of the minor functions and should pretty much fade into the background, sort of like set dressing. In a large temple, there'll be a hierarchy, and acolytes are at the bottom of that hierarchy. In that case, you shouldn't really need this stat block unless something unexpected happens, but it's always nice to have. Now, if you wanted to run a combat encounter there, maybe, but you might not even want to do that. There would just be so many of them, and they're something the party shouldn't really be paying attention to. Acolytes in the situation would probably be mostly younger people who have been learning to be a cleric or priest since they were children, and now that they're interacting with the people, they are hopefully reaching the end of their studies and will become full clerics or full priests soon. Older acolytes are probably people who have been there also since they were children, and for whatever reason, they just haven't progressed past Acolyte, and by this point probably never will. You might also want to have an older Acolyte or two who came to the god or goddess's service later in life, and then there's the question of what happened in their life to set them on this path, rather than the one they'd been on before. And that's just in case your characters are just hanging out in the temple and they go off script in the way that players always go off script. The second way to use the Acolyte is in a smaller and or a rural temple. In this case, I would have a few, maybe only one priest, and everyone else would be acolytes. And I'm thinking like 12 or fewer people in this entire temple. In those temples, they would be treated better and they'd be on a more equal status with as the priest than in the larger temple we just talked about. There's probably not the large emphasis on becoming a full cleric or a full priest, and there could be some people who have been there for decades serving the temple, or centuries in the case of some of the longer-lived races, like the elves and the dwarves. And they've never progressed past Acolyte, and no one really sees anything wrong with that. Here, too, would help to think of why the Acolytes have entered the temple. Have they been doing it since they were children, or did they come in later in life for some reason? And these Acolytes you're going to want to think about a little bit more, because they're probably going to be someone your players speak to, especially if this is like a temple with a dozen people in it and your party is in its first couple of levels. They're probably going to talk to an Acolyte before they sort of prove themselves to the priest. Now, the last major way to use the stat block, and probably the most common way, is as part of an adventuring party. Either an NPC that travels with your player characters, or as a part of an evil or at least rival group. And in that case, you can easily use the stat block as presented, or you can change it in a few ways. But before we get into that, one more quick thing. If it's part of an evil or rival group, you would use Acolyte instead of making a cleric, because that's what an Acolyte is. It's an NPC cleric. The first thing to do is, again, decide on what race the character is and change its stats accordingly. Although if you pick a human, the only thing that will functionally change is it gets a +1 in charisma, because that is the only odd stat they have. It's a quick and easy change and will help create a framework to make the Acolyte seem like a real character. It's something you can do on the fly in a couple of seconds and then describe the character as such, and it's just a really great way to flesh out the character with the smallest amount of time. The second thing you'd want to do is give them a domain. That gives them a couple of domain spells, maybe a domain ability, and we'll also peg them down as a follower of whatever god or goddess in your world has that domain. Again, this is also fleshing out the character a bit, as we're changing them from the base stat block and making them a more interesting and dynamic enemy and character. Now, consider changing the weapon that they have, especially based on the god they follow. For example, an Acolyte of Thor would probably have some sort of hammer, whereas a follower of Yukazami... Is that right? I don't remember the name. But the Shinto god of the moon, his followers would have a bow. A long bow, actually. And, you can go through each god and their, a follower of Poseidon or Neptune would have a trident. Things like that. And also, since clubs are one of the least damaging weapons in the game, this is also a way to slightly increase the power of that NPC. Another way to do some changes, although it's longer and more involved than the previous few, and something you probably want to avoid for anything but set-piece battles, is because if you have a whole list of minor NPCs and you individually do this step, that's too much preparation. You're over preparing if you're doing this with every NPC. Is change their spells. You can go to the cleric spell list in the player's handbook and swap out any of their cantrips for any of the others. Listed, they have Light, Sacred Flame, and Thaumaturgy. For first level slots, they have Bless, Cure Wounds, and Sanctuary, which makes them a generic, most likely good aligned cleric who does a support role. There's a lot of other options. And you would just swap out any of the lists. There really isn't a good way to make the Acolyte any less powerful than it already is. It's pretty weak, to be honest, and if your party is having difficulty taking out a single Acolyte, I would say that's indicative of other problems at the table. And so instead of trying to make this easier, you might want to sit down with your players and try and figure out what's up. So we're just going to ignore trying to make it less powerful. However, there are plenty of ways to make it stronger. What I would do is start leveling it like a cleric. So go to the cleric class and see how their amount of spells change at every level. For every level you give it in that way, don't forget to add an extra d8 to their health. If you don't want to roll for that, just figure out the average health. Just remember that the average roll for a d8 is 4.5. You could also give better weapons than, which is something we've mentioned. You can give them armor. If they're a high enough level that you would want to start considering like magic items or upping their stats, you would probably want to switch over to Priest, which we're going to be talking about in about a minute or so. But doing any of those changes that I've mentioned will make the Acolyte a tougher opponent, well, at least mostly preserving its purpose. And that's all I've got on the Acolyte. But now we're going to get into the Priest. So moving on to the Priest. The Priest is what you would sub in for the Acolyte once you wanted a higher level character, and it is essentially a 5th level cleric that has gotten a paladin spell. And to just go over the stat block really quickly, as an armor class of 13, hit points of 5d8 plus 5, which averages out to 27. Interestingly, has a speed of 25 feet. Has a little bit of armor, +1 to its constitution, which is where you get the +5. It's essentially 5th level. +1 to intelligence, +3 to wisdom, +1 to charisma. It has training in medicine, persuasion, and religion, passive perception of 13, knows 2 languages, and has a challenge rating of 2. Now moving into its special attacks. It has Divine Eminence, which allows the priest to use a spell slot to do an extra 3d6 or 10 radiant damage if it hits on all of the attacks for that turn. If it uses a second or third level spell, that adds 1d6 for second and 2d6 for third. So if it uses one of its 2 third level spell slots for Divine Eminence, it does 5d6 damage. This is a slightly weaker version of the Paladin's Divine Smite ability. Divine Smite uses d8s rather than d6s. And then it is a spellcaster. It has the same 3 cantrips as the Acolyte. And then, let me check, it has 4 first level slots. It's changed out the Bless for a Guiding Bolt, which is a damaging spell. It has 3 slots at second level with 2 spells for that, and 2 slots at third level with 2 spells. And then it has a Mace, which has a +2 to hit, reach of 5 feet, and does 1d6 bludgeoning damage. So, slightly more deadly in melee combat, with a slightly higher armor class. Much better spells. And yeah, so that's kind of the stat block. Now, priests are the heads of temples. They bring the teachings of the gods to the common folk. They're spiritual leaders and often hold positions of influence. Evil priests might work openly under a tyrant, or they might be the leaders of religious sects hidden in the shadows of good society. And then it ends with a priest typically has 1 or more acolytes to help with religious ceremonies and other sacred duties. Which what that tells me is, unless you're using the priest as part of an adventuring party, always have acolytes with a priest. In fact, I would actually use a priest in the same way I would use an acolyte. In Urban Temple, there's going to be several priests. They're also going to be in a hierarchy. And for the top priests, you might want to make them more powerful, which we'll go over that in a minute. And then in a smaller or rural temple, you'd want like 1 priest, maybe 2 or 3, depending on the size of the temple. And then again, using them as an adventuring party. You could also use it as a NPC that travels with the player characters to fill in the healer spot, or again as part of an evil or rival group. Again, their main thing would be healing and support. But obviously you would want to use this for a higher level party, ones that are well known in the local area and are starting to make it into the second tier of adventuring. So right around 5th to 7th level would be a good time to have a priest be part of a group. And then just talking about how you could go about changing this. Again, it can be any race, so giving racial traits. Good way to change up some of the stats, and also a good way to help solidify in your mind things about this character. Again, Furblog is the way you want to go if you're looking for a optimized route, because a Furblog would take the 16 wisdom, make it 18, which makes its spell DC goes up to 14 from 13, and gives a +6 to hit with spell attacks rather than the +5. And then looking through, well, the second thing you want to do is, again, this is the same video as the Acolyte, because all of my comments are pretty much the same, because the Acolyte and the Priest are the two clerics in the NPC. They're the two healers. They're very similar. One is more powerful than the other, and that's about it. Give it a domain. That gives it some domain spells. And keep in mind, this is a 5th level priest, so it's going to have 1, if not 2, domain abilities. And if you decide to sort of level this up similar to how you'd level up a cleric, remember 6th level gets another ability for most domains. I wouldn't really do anything to make the priest less powerful. I would use an Acolyte instead. Just as, if you start leveling up an Acolyte, you really quickly hit the point where you probably just want to switch over to a priest. But yeah, to make a priest more powerful, level them up like a cleric. Change out the spells that he has. Give him a different weapon that's more befitting of the god or goddess they follow. Things like that. Yeah, and that's going to be about it for the Acolyte and the Priest, and the first video where we go through the monster manual.